Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I am very, very pleased to be mediating this first online launch of the latest Italian Studies special issue, which, as you know, is entitled Mediating Dante. Not only am I pleased to be here this evening in this capacity because the issue, as we will see, is extremely rich and innovative and important, but also on a more personal level, I am very glad because the two editors, Dr. Coluzzi and Dr. Bowe, who have invested an enormous amount of energies on this issue, are also two great friends and colleagues to me. As you certainly know, the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland, of which Dr. Coluzzi and Dr. Bowe are two of the very first members, has been working untiringly over the past few years, not to mention in particular the Anno Dantesco. So I was saying the Centre has been working to support a transdisciplinary culture of collaborative research across the various trends of Dante studies. And we are particularly proud to embrace and to promote different approaches and methodologies across the Centre. And I think I am representing the spirit of the Centre when I say that the importance and the resonance and the richness of the Centre itself lies in this openness and in the dialogues that the members of the Centre have been able to establish within and outside the Centre itself. So this special issue is very much a product of this environment and of the spirit. In a moment, I'll leave the floor to the two editors who will be introducing the issue and more broadly its approach and goals. And after that, we'll have the chance to hear the authors of the articles who will be presenting very briefly their papers. At the end, there will be space for questions and comments from the audience, and we very much hope that this will be another occasion of reflection and dialogue. Even if we don't need this, actually, because we all know the two editors, let me quickly introduce them. Federica Coluzzi is a Leveron Research Fellow at the University of Warwick, where she is working on her second research project entitled Dante's Transnational Female Public in the Long 19th Century, 1799-1921. She has been an RSc postdoctoral fellow at UCC, where she completed a first monograph entitled Dante Beyond Influence, Rethinking Reception in Victorian Literary Culture, published by Manchester University Press in 2021. Also, she is co-editor with Jacob Blakesley of the volume Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Translation and Reception History, The Afterlife of Dante's Vita Nuova in the Anglophone World, published by Routledge and expected in September 2022. And more broadly, Federica's research focuses on Dante's critical reception in the long 19th century in Great Britain, Ireland, and Italy, among the many other interests she has. David is a former Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Italian at UCC. He previously held teaching and research roles at Somerville, Pembroke, and Balliol colleges at the University of Oxford, where he also completed his PhD. His research focuses on the representation of feminine voices in medieval and early modern Italian texts, on Dante, of course, on the early vernacular lyric poetry, and on the mediation and adaptation of Dante's works in literature and the visual arts. Is the author of the monograph Poetry in Dialogue in the Duecento and Dante, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, and of many articles and book chapters on temporality, gender, and subjectivity in medieval Italian poetry. David is also the editor of the first publication of Rachel Owen's illustration of Dante's Inferno for Bodleian Library Publishing. I'll now leave the floor to the two editors who will introduce the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Fede?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Valentina, as well. And I was going to say, do you want to start the dance?
Okay. It's like many things in contemporary academia, both positive and negative. This whole project started because of Twitter. Many years ago now, what feels like many years ago now, back in the heady days of, I think it was probably about 2013. 14. Federica was coming down to Oxford for a research trip, and we'd been following each other over Twitter through Italian studies things, and we said, oh, let's get a coffee and have a chat. And that chat was the beginning of all this. So Takeaway Coffee in the Sun became several years worth of collaboration, conference panels, workshops, and eventually an issue with so many of our wonderful collaborators and contributors here today. The question that kind of first got us going was one about the ways in which we see, in a broad sense, medieval text like Dante through later eyes, whether they be in visual, through the visual cultures, through literatures, through pedagogy, through critical traditions, and how that can help inform us, or how that does inform us in our approach to Dante today, how those varied traditions kind of filter into scholarship, filter into our teaching, filter into our outreach, and filter into the public image, as it were, of a figure like Dante. So Dante is at the same time a case study has at the same time been a case study for a broader conceptual approach, but also in some ways a unique case because of the sheer cultural ubiquity of something like the Inferno. I think the contributions in the issue really demonstrate that cultural ubiquity, from everything from fine art to video games, and contributions which we heard in various stages along this process at the various conferences and workshops, including manga and comic books and literary rewritings and critical editions and frescoes and movies and street art and everything, really. There doesn't seem to be a media untouched by that hasn't touched Dante, I should say, because that's kind of the emphasis that we've taken throughout this process, is rather than thinking about necessarily Dante's influence, thinking about the ways in which other thinkers, artists, creatives have engaged with Dante themselves. So putting the dynamic process, making it not a passive process of receiving Dante's influence, but a dynamic process of engaging with the author.
Absolutely. This was our reasoning, and when David was saying about collaboration, yes, the collaboration started with a tweet and with a coffee, eventually developed, and as we detailed in our introduction to the issue, into multiple occasions for exchange and collaboration. It started with two wonderful and very rich panels on the visual mediation of Dante's works at ICE, at the American Association of Italian Studies Conference in Sorrento, and then it led to a workshop, a daily workshop at UCC hosted by Katherine, where we gathered some of today's contributors and asked them to think about how Dante is mediated by multiple media and forms of reception and transformation in contemporary and ancient culture. And it also led to something that we missed, and I'm very sorry to realize that we missed referring to that, but it also led to a very interdisciplinary research day at University of Hull, thanks to our colleagues there, who were discussing and thinking about issues of icons and iconicity. So our own discussion on Dante intercepted others' work on forms of mediation in modern and contemporary culture. And finally, it also led to a final panel at the SIS in Edinburgh, the very last SIS before the pandemic. And in that case, we had other researchers from the States and from the University of Manchester who contributed to the lively conversation. Unfortunately, as you know, like a special issue can contain only so many of our papers and investigations, but we are really proud of the cohort of researchers that we brought together with our issue. And I just want to mention them and to introduce them. I can see them all. So Helena Philip Robbins, Kat Powlesland, Martina Piperno and Jennifer Rushworth, along with David and I, contributed articles to this special issue. And I would say that the way we thought of this launch was to give 5 minutes, couple of minutes to each of our contributors to really introduce and discuss their article, as well as think about what are the new perspectives, what are the new pathways into researching Dantean mediations. And if it's okay with you, I would like to start with my own experience and what led to my own article, and then we can keep the ball rolling and have each other take turns in introducing their own work. So for me personally, the Mediating Dante project really planted a seed that grew over the years and blossomed into my current postdoctoral project. Because although my discovery of Evelyn's Paul illuminated edition of the Vita Nuova occurred the previous summer in a second-hand bookshop in Kew Gardens, the ice panels were the first instance in which I started to think about and to think historically about the relationship between Dantean textuality and the female public. So what started with the study of women's artists, medievalist remediations of the Vita Nuova into modern illuminated manuscripts really developed into a more transnational and transhistorical exploration. That is my current project, that is trying to trace women's experiences as readers and students, critics and scholars, poets and writers, patrons and collectors of Dante across 3 different countries, Ireland, Great Britain and Italy, and throughout the long 19th century. And my article for our special issue was really like the first step, the first baby step into this broader project. So I'm extremely grateful to David and to all the others who really made me think about and think more about these beautiful artifacts that led the way into my new project. And just to briefly show you what my article does, I prepared like a very short slide. I know some others have slides, so they're more practical, I think. But my article really carries out a close comparative reading of 2 modern illuminated manuscripts of the Vita Nuova by an arts and crafts artist named Fibiana Taker and a London-based professional, Evelyn Paul. It reconstructs the broader historical and social context that fostered the revival of illumination in mid to late Victorian Britain, which of course intercepted the revival of interest for Dante himself and for the study of Dante. It unpacks the inner mechanism of pictorial, decorative, and typographical mediation used by the 2 artists, by Taker and Paul. And here I place some images to give you an idea of what the actual manuscripts look like. And finally, it considers how the editions introduce elite arts of poetry, Dante, and manuscript illumination within the intellectual and even the economic reach of the middle class mass public. Finally, it really pondered how these popular artifacts ultimately remediated Dante's libello for a whole new reading public that was acquiring the book for their own pleasure, for their own later reading, that had very different approaches to the reading and to the study of the text, remediated and transformed through visual and typographical mediums. And so my questions about mediation was how we think of how do we think of Dante's relationship to a foreign visual and literary culture, the British one, and what was the role that women held within dynamic of reception. So, and with this, I hand over to our contributors. I'm gonna stop my sharing. Who wants to go next? Kat?
Yeah, I'm very happy to go next. Thank you very much for inviting me throughout the process. Actually, I think I missed the very first stage of it, but joined at Cork and was really delighted to come along. So yeah, so I just wanted to say a few words about what I've written. I've also got a slide actually, which I'll show you in just a moment. But also just to sort of give a little bit of context actually. So perhaps I'll start with that. So the reason really why I work with video game critical theory, which is what I work with in relation to Dante. So my position essentially is that video game critical theory gives us a whole new set of tools for understanding what the commedia is inviting us as readers to do. Video games, I would say, in many ways are absolutely brilliant at, in fact, I would say probably they're usually designed to keep us immersed, to keep us very engaged, to want us to keep coming back, and in some cases to make us feel that we've had an incredibly realistic experience in a virtual space. And I wonder if for Dante's that may already be, the Dante's that's already ringing bells. So one way that video games do this, and some games obviously are much better at this than others, is by creating a virtual world that reproduces the cues or the feedback that we receive when we act in the real world. So the sense of the wind on your face when you descend at speed, for example, an eyebrow that's raised, or a tentative hand that raises your pulse just very slightly, and snatches of song, I'm looking at Helena now, that go on to play out in your head, even when you're out of earshot. So done well, or done systematically, these cues, many of them happen, I think, at the level of the unconscious, are what make us feel present. That is, that we are experientially immersed in a space in which we have agency. So the way Dante does it, and I'd say not just well, but brilliantly, if I'm allowed to put in a plug here, the way he does that so brilliantly is described in my forthcoming book, Narrative Strategies for Participation in Dante's Divine Comedy, coming out with Legenda imminently. Essentially, what I'm suggesting is it all depends on narrative mechanisms and strategies that we have not yet looked for systematically in the commedia. So if I just very quickly share one slide with you, just to give you a quick visual overview of what I'm talking about in the article. So here, so on the left, we've got the box art for the game that is probably the most controversial game. So that's the one that I opened the article with, Dante's Inferno by Electronic Arts. That's 2010 game, still staggering on. It was going very strong at one point, it's now staggering along. I'm also going to do, I talk in the article a little bit towards the end about a game called That Dragon Cancer, which I think, well, as we go through the article, what I'm trying to get to a point of doing is saying, are there any games that do what I think the commedia is inviting us to do? And then obviously on the right, we just have the most wonderful bit, which is just part of a manuscript. So I just wanted to show you that, and then I'll just now just take you through just the main elements of the article. So the related questions, as I say, that I wanted to address in the article is whether a video game can actually do what the commedia does, which obviously needs a lot of definition. So I had some fun at the start of the article with the best known commedia inspired game. It says it's inspired by the text, but many people might not necessarily recognize that if they play the game. So that's Dante's Inferno, which is a 2010 hack and slash third-person action adventure game. There's a fantastic bit with Jonathan Wright, who's the writer-producer of the game, where he's wrangling with the problem, and he says, essentially, if you're trying to make an action game, it's thin. This is him talking about the commedia. It's Dante, who's kind of passive, and he's a poet, and he's philosophical. His gameplay engineer, Tom Wilson, says, well, come on, that would suck as a game. So the commedia, importantly, is not an action adventure game. It's a narrative of revelation, amongst many other things. These two things are obviously very different things, but there are other games. So I go on to this to some extent in the article. There's a casual puzzler called Dante the Inferno, whose strapline is "Have a hell of a good time in Inferno." There's a shoot 'em up called Dante's Bullet Inferno, which is endorsed by critics as, I quote, a solid time waste, which is a good thing for this type of game. There's Janton's Red and the Deadly Sins. I talk about that, a cartoon style, very spare, very gappy, very texty game, so we're already moving into different territory. This is a game that brings us somewhere that I think is more interesting, essentially, when we're thinking about what the Commedia does, and certainly taking us away from the action-adventure genre of Dante's Inferno. And then I go on to look at certain non-Commedia related simulation games that invite the participation of certain of the higher executive functions. So I talk about Zoe Quinn's Depression Quest. I talk about Alexander Tave's Dementia Simulator, Forget Me Not. I talk about MIT's Passage Home that explores and exposes unconscious race bias. And then finally, the game I talk about the most is, as I say, That Dragon Cancer. So that's Numinous Games' That Dragon Cancer, which is a game that was written by two parents called Ryan and Amy Green. And it's a game that invites the player to engage with the real life journey of a family whose young son, Joel, is dying of cancer. The game is supremely gappy. It's rich with text. It's deceptively simple. Polygonal characters are powerfully and realistically animated by real video footage of their gestures, their postures, their gait, their carriage. You, the player, can engage with the journey to the extent that you wish, standing back as observer, getting more involved as participant. It's a game that, in the words of video game critic Rich Stanton, quote, understands that one of the beauties of interaction is in giving the player space to think about their own experiences. So I won't preempt my conclusion here. I'm hoping that some people want to read or have read the article. I'm very happy to discuss anything in the article. I know it's sort of very different compared to obviously everything else in the article, and that it's talking about video games, very different genre. But I also, as I say, I've got a book coming out later this year with Legenda, which I hope sets out some of the theories that I use in much more depth. So yeah, just to say thank you, and over to the next person.
Who wants to go next? Hi, Jenny.
Hello. I have a glass in my hand because I thought this was mainly a celebratory launch and not an academic launch, and now I'm quite intimidated to have to say something about the papers, but maybe I can just be the celebration moment. But thank you so much for the opportunity to participate, and lovely memories of the Cork event, which now seems a long time ago when we were, in a room together and in Cork, and it was a wonderful visit. So thank you very much to Federica and to Di and to the Dante Centre at Cork for the funding and for the support, and thank you to Italian Studies for seeing this through to the end. And it was such a pleasure to participate in this, and I haven't seen my paper copy yet, but I look forward to receiving that. Yeah, I haven't really prepared a formal talk, but I suppose I can say that the article is about the work I've been doing on Bart's reading of Dante, and I think that this is interesting partly because Bart is obviously known as this kind of, he didn't believe in the author, etc. He's not interested in that. He's also not really interested in Italian literature, and he's not interested in poetry. So when he writes about literature, he tends to write about French prose writers, really. So it could be Proust, it could be Flaubert, it could be Balzac, etc. So he's not known for that. And so I started to think, is he interested in Dante at all? Is that just because I'm interested in Bart and Dante? Maybe. I was thinking, where can we triangulate this? But it's also because later in his life, he started to think about the idea of writing a novel that would be called Vita Nova. And he calls it a novel, but he says that a novel could be any form. In fact, it just would be a form that is new to him. So he says he's fed up of university lectures and academic writing, and maybe this is familiar to us sometimes, and he has this dream of writing differently, and so he wants to write a novel called Vita Nova, which is clearly inspired by Dante. It's also inspired by Mele, which is something else I've been looking into, because clearly the idea of a Vita Nova or new life or conversion is not specific to Dante, but he's one of the most famous users of that phrase. But in fact, when Bart's thinking about new life, he's thinking mainly about the Commedia. So he really does that thing that Dante scholars shouldn't do, which is to connect like new life with like being in the dark wood and coming out of it. And so he reads the two, and he does mention the Convivio a few times, but he doesn't go into it very much. And in this article, I'm trying to do two things, which is possibly not a very good idea for an article, but never do two things in an article. But one thing is to think about how Dante is interested in mediation. And so what figures of mediation does he use? And so could we use Dante as a kind of theoretical tool for understanding the later reception? And so that's where I'm looking at guides, guide, the book as a guide, and at the Screen Lady. So I'm thinking about where Dante explicitly reflects on mediation. And for me, the Screen Lady is a really fascinating example of that, you know, that's literally nel mezzo, in the middle, in between, that he's looking at Beatrice and there's this woman in between. And that, yes, it's very easy for him to say, this is a scream for my love for Beatrice, but then when he writes about the Screen Lady leaving, and he's sad, as he says himself in the words that I've not forgotten, but that he's sadder than he thought he would be. So actually there's something kind of repressed about that, or that the rational explanation you get the Screen Lady is hiding something else. I'm not sure what, but I was interested. So one thing I'm interested in is, what kind of figures of mediation does Dante use? And could we use that idea of a guide, for instance, or a booker's guide, or the Screen Lady, for thinking about mediation and what it's like for us to read Dante? And that's the second half, I guess, is, although I don't think I did it in that order, I think I did it the other way around, but to think about the ways in which, if I wanted to think about how did Bart read Dante, it's never a direct encounter, and we all know that it's never a direct encounter with the text, it's through various intermediaries. And so to think about that specifically for Bart, and yes, there are specific French translations that he references, and there are critics that he worked with who he also cites their works. But I think the sort of important thing for Dante studies, I guess, that I'm trying to say, and that I think Federica is saying as well in her work, is that the Dante commentary tradition is not only interesting if it's the early commentaries and it's Latin, it can also be interesting for vernacular modern languages. And so I suppose I was trying to think just now, would I say that Bart was a good reader of Dante? That's what I thought I'd sort of put forward today. And I think he's not a good reader of Dante in that he reads it very partially, he reads fragments, you know, he's obsessed with the Inferno, which is very, you know, it's not very enlightened, or, you know, it's sort of very predictable in that way. He doesn't really want to get out of the dark wood, and I've written about that elsewhere, in fact in a book that just came out, which is sat here, which is called Dwelling on Grief, which I mentioned. It's published by Legenda, partly why I mentioned it. It also has a really beautiful poem by David Bowe in it, so I recommend that to you, so do go and read this, Dwelling on Grief, Narratives of Mourning Across Time and Forms. But as I explore in that chapter as well, which is part of this broader project, as I said, on Bart's reading of Dante, he doesn't really want to get out of the dark woods, so it's not very much of the Commedia. So is he a good reader? No. But on the other hand, what's good about his reading? I think he reads footnotes, you know, he reads translations, he reads multiple translations, he reads critical works. And maybe all of us are interested in that kind of fragmentary episodic reading, and he also reads it as a way for his own creativity, and that's quite, I don't know if that makes him a good reader or not, it was a silly question, but it's quite exciting. And so yeah, mainly I'm here drinking pink fizz and saying thank you to the editors for the opportunity, and I'm really happy to be part of this process. I think, you know, thinking about, yeah, more recent, like where is the commentary tradition today, or in the last kind of 50 years, and where is it in different languages, and how could we allow translation to be more a part of that story, so not just Latin or Italian, but in my case French, and in Federica's case also English. But thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. Who wants to go next? We have some few contributors more.
I'm happy to.
Oh, I have to jump back in. Helena has a really beautiful chapter in this book as well, which says something about overlapping networks. And I'm sorry, Helena, I'm a bit overwhelmed by various things at the moment. But Helena has a really lovely chapter in this book as well, so you must go and read it. If anyone else has a contributor, I apologise. It's been a while since I did the proofs, and my mind is elsewhere.
That's very nice of you. Yeah, well, yeah, thank you to Federica and Di for having me, and for having me back in Cork as well. So I haven't either prepared a super formal presentation, though I do have some images. So I will share my screen just for a moment. Okay, so what I was trying to do in my contribution was to think about mediation theologically, and again to do two things. One, to think a little bit about in the comedy, in Dante, how might we think about human interactions, human encounters as mediating the divine, and the divine is present in human encounters. And obviously that's a vast topic and very much in dialogue with Vittorio Montemaggi's work and Christian Maves's work. So that I was just, that was just one small aspect of that. So I was trying to think particularly about how Christ might be mediated in human encounters. So one in the comedy, and then in the illustrations in this particular manuscript. So maybe what I'll do in the next 2 minutes is just share some images from this manuscript, which is Vatlat 4776, produced at the end between about 1390 and 1400. And it's got various styles of illustration. What you have on the slide here is a figured initial and decorated margins. And we have this for the first folio of each cantica. Then Inferno is fully illustrated with illuminations. You have one example here. One of the interesting things about them is this very delicate, subtle use of color. Purgatorio is not illustrated at all. And then Paradiso, and these are the illustrations that I talked about in the article. Paradiso, the first 11 cantos are illustrated, and they're illustrated with line drawings. And I'm not sure how well it comes across on the screen, but they are particularly high quality draftsmanship. And I guess the two sort of things I was interested in these drawings is one, the artist never depicts any details of setting. It's only the figures, and he seems to be interested precisely in human interactions and in the gestures, the postures, the gazes with which people interact with each other. So that's one thing. And then connected, and here I'm coming on to mediation, the majority of these line drawings for the first 11 cantos of Paradiso have, and you can see here, perhaps if I can make I'll go back. Here, they have a small head and neck of Christ enclosed in a nimbus. Now, Christ doesn't, in any straightforward sense, participate in the narrative, in the narrative of these cantos, but the majority of these images have this depiction of Christ. And as you can see, do I have a slightly more close-up one? Yep, there. They're reminiscent of depictions of the Veronica or the Holy Face, so this very popular devotional image. So what I was suggesting, looking at these line drawings, is that two things really. That one, this artist is thinking sort of more in perhaps what is implicit in the comedy, but this artist is thinking about explicitly is how might we think about the presence of Christ in human interactions? And so one, that question, and two, how far are these images, what sort of engagement are they prompting from the viewer? So if we think about these depictions of Christ as reminiscent of that devotional iconography of the Veronica or the Holy Face, which aimed to stimulate a response, a desiring response from the viewer. One of the aims of the Veronica was to prompt viewers' desire to see Christ. Then how far might we think about these images as prompting viewers to some sort of first-person engagement with Christ? So I will stop there. Those were both thinking about mediation in the comedy and then mediation of Christ in these images. I was trying to start to think about some sort of theological ways we might think about these questions about mediation. So I will hand over.
Will I hop in there? Thanks so much, everyone, for their presentations so far. And I know that we're hoping to hear from Martina as well later, but she's currently struggling with an unstable connection.
I can do it now, I think.
Oh,
I can
ready?
try.
Okay.
I can
Wonderful.
try at
Then
least.
let's hear from Martina before me, and I can run things.
Hi everyone, I'm home finally, so I managed to follow most of the meeting, and now hopefully the connection will be stable enough. So thank you so much for this meeting. Thank you so much for having my contribution in the special issue. It's, among other things, a reminder of my time at Cork, where I intersected David and Federica, and just for, I think for just a couple of days, maybe also Valentina. And I was physically there, even if I was not presenting at the research day, where I had Helena and Kath also presented. So I feel like a little bit of an outsider, but also tangentially part of the project. So at the time of that research day, I was working on this bizarre research topic, which has been mine in the last few years, about the reception of the pre-classical antiquity in modern literature. And weirdly, precisely in those exact months, I was starting to look at Dante's reception, meaning I was starting looking at how people obsessed with some people obsessed with the idea that something of an Etruscan legacy might have survived in Dante's blood, and from there kind of remain in Tuscan blood up to more recent times, like in Carducci, or even more generally in Tuscany, in the blood of modern Tuscans, which is weird and fun and interesting, because it also ended up on the pages of La Difesa della Razza. It ended up being a chapter, a part of the construction of racist thought in Italy. Very weird, very strange remediation of Dante. This also has to do with a particular approach to archaeology and some artifacts, some of which are illustrated in the article, and some aspects that have to do with the materiality of Dante's text. That is, the idea that his verses somehow convey an idea of color, not only because they talk about colors, but they kind of are colorful in a way, and that have almost a sculptural quality. So the paragraph I enjoyed writing the most was precisely that, looking at how many during the course of the Dante's reception commented on the fact that he was like a sculpture in words, which seems to have a little bit of a tradition, starting, I think, from Benedetto Varchi, although I'm not too sure that's starting point. It looks like it, ending up at least in Leopardi, in Gioberti, and even more recent times. So somehow, weirdly, my research brought me closer to what my colleagues at Cork were doing at the time, and it was really fun and interesting to see how my research, starting from a completely different point and not really relating to Dante, ended up being relevant to the research that was being carried out in the Dante Center at Cork at the time. I take this opportunity to thank you for hosting me as an outsider, to Federica, David, and to Dara for reading the proofs of my work on Dante's reception, and to everyone here for listening.
Thank you, Martina. I'm so glad you made it home in time. So it falls to me. I want to say I've just filled the glass in solidarity with Jenny. So cheers. But also to again reiterate our thanks to everyone who did contribute to every stage in this project, and to the immense work that went into producing these contributions, editing these contributions, and proofing and peer reviewing these contributions under the difficult circumstances that were the first 2 years of the pandemic. I particularly want to thank Sylvia and Heather, who unfortunately isn't with us today, for their patience and support and encouragement in bringing this volume to a buon fine, given all the kind of exigencies of the situation. And I think that it's important to note that. And I think another thing that I find interesting to reflect on, and perhaps something that we can chat about a little bit later, is how much perhaps our lived experience of mediation has inflected and affected our kind of thinking about this topic and our engagement with our own material over the last over the last couple of years. Sorry, I keep grabbing my cable with my foot. I'm not trying to introduce high budget shaky cam effects. As much as that perhaps might add to the verisimilitude, Kath, I don't know. I want to share one slide with you, which is will be probably more or less familiar to you. And I want to actually, there we go. Hopefully you can all see this, which is the image for Rachel Owen's illustration for Inferno 1. I'm sticking with Inferno 1 for the sake of its the way that it indicates so much of what is to come, the way that it articulates a lot of the topics that I was interested in exploring through my own work on mediation, and just to give everyone another chance to look at one of Rachel's wonderful illustrations. The reason I've as I said, I've chosen this is for three very striking features which which to me are key in her approach to mediation, the mediation of Dante. The first is the canto by canto approach that she took, which involved a great deal of narrative, of compressing a great deal of narrative time and information essentially into a single frame, so that our experience of the text is simultaneously relatively holistic and dynamic. For the removal of the figure of Dante from the illustrative program entirely, at no point do we see Dante in third person. In fact, we are encouraged to view the entire experience of the Commedia in first person, to occupy the shoes of the eyes, the gaze of the pilgrim passing through the Commedia, and in ways that challenges us, I think, to think afresh about the text, to think about how even the role of that pilgrim, even the figure of that pilgrim, is, well, think about the way that Dante himself is a mediator for the Inferno, if we believe the fiction of the text, and so it is a text that is always already mediated, and the ways in which Virgil acts as a mediator, and the translucence that she always uses to illustrate the figure of Virgil he becomes a screen, or in this case perhaps she, the gender is certainly ambiguous, so they become a screen through which we view everything else. This is particularly obvious at this point, and it comes, and again in the encounter with Beatrice, the narrative of Beatrice's intervention in Inferno 2, and again in the encounter with Ulysses and Diomedes in Inferno 26. At those points, we are literally experiencing the scene through the tracing paper Virgil, who stands between us and the remainder of the image. The third thing I wanted to that I kind of highlight, and that became a particular focus, if not obsession, of mine, apologies for the passing sirens, was the question of paratext, of those things which exist alongside or in direct relationship with what we consider to be the text, capital T, and shape, mediate, and govern our engagement with it, or inflect our engagement with it. Something with which Rachel was highly aware, having herself undertaken extensive research on manuscript, illustrative traditions in Quattrocento manuscripts of Dante, and also someone who taught Dante, and she brings, I think, these two perspectives into play in her work, using in often, I think, tongue-in-cheek or at least provocative ways, the extant paratextual apparatus that exists around the Commedia. So here we see the three beasts identified by, or shaped out of, or you might say obscured by, the text of the Dante Encyclopedia entry on the three beasts, explaining their allegorical implications, to such an extent that they cease to be beasts and become merely bodies of text. She is also very attentive to to careful labeling. So, for example, later on we'll see the same technique used to depict Bertrand de Born, and you see using the entry for contrapasso. So literally in him you see the word contrapasso, così si rime, lo contrappasso. Whereas here, as you can see, the image of the lion on the left-hand side of the screen, the lonza and lupa have been carefully crossed out and the word leone underlined, so there can be no confusion as to which beast this one might be. And this practice of labeling, which is common also in manuscripts like the Holcomb manuscript. And in fact, I've got my slightly remixed Holcomb image of the Holcomb manuscript on the next slide, just so you can see the Dante and Virgil labels. That is, of course, incorporating Inferno 2 to fill in the gap in the Holcomb manuscript where damage has eradicated the figure of presumably Beatrice and also Virgil. The kind of incorporating these acts of labeling in her visual work, making them part of, or rendering them as part of a kind of paratextual visual tradition, which has been part of the production of the Commedia for centuries, and in this work kind of, I think, asking us to think about or reevaluate our relationship with the text through the image, a kind of immediation. I've kind of used the word immediation a few times, the idea of something that that through mediation, through mediating, makes something seem or feel more immediate, despite the fact we know there are intermediate layers. So it's a lot of cognates of mediate there, which piling up on top of one another, perhaps inevitably in this context. So that's really this for me, this project took a whole different direction, and in fact kind of grew out of my interest and experience of Rachel Owen's illustrations, without which I would certainly not have I don't think found my way into this kind of conversation in the way that I have. So I'm very grateful for the existence of that work. I'm very grateful for all of the collaborators and the immense work that everyone's put in, and the kind of, I hope, the ongoing community that has developed out of these discussions and collaborations and events. So I will pass it over back to Valentina.
Oh, thank you very much to all speakers who, I mean, not only have very, very briefly summarized the main points of their article, but also they gave us an idea of the background of maybe where their research came from, and definitely enriched our reading. I have a question perhaps for the entire group of speakers, but this is the time for question in general. So if you have any question, feel free to raise your hand. And so I might ask a question if other people are thinking about it. Okay, we already have a question, so I'll shut up. Please, Dennis Looney, you're welcome.
Thank you. My little friend has gone, so I'm more at liberty. Yeah, thank you all very much. This was a very stimulating review, or sneak preview, as it were, of what's coming. But my question, which I actually had from the very beginning, was sort of summarized in some ways by what David was just saying, and it's about the word mediation. And, you know, it's obviously a rich term, as we were hearing, because you can talk about mediating and intermediate status of a text and media in different media, and maybe even remediating. No one's said that quite, but, you know, somehow reclaiming Dante for a public in a way that is an act of remediation, perhaps. And so I was going to ask from the beginning, please say more about that, but a more specific question for everybody would be, is there a source, maybe I shouldn't use that word, where does the word mediation first get used in regard to Dante studies? I would like to go explore that in more detail. And let me just say, I mean, I've thought a lot about influence and reception and source criticism, you know, going back, thinking more about Renaissance, the kinds of things that Martina was talking about, Renaissance and classical antiquity, where source criticism is such a venerable practice. And I've tried to think about ways to do that differently. And then I just paused and stopped doing that, thinking about that quite, but it dawns on me that mediation with the play on media is a good way. So my question is, who else beyond you guys does this, and is there one, locus classicus, as it were, for mediation? And I can think of various ways myself to respond to that, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
That's a magnificent question. Thank you, Dennis. And it also, I think, behoves us to recognize work, very much including your own, on the way that Dante's text has been redeployed and engaged with across media, thinking particularly about your work about freedom readers, but also then thinking about the discussions in the Metamorphosing Dante book published out of, which emerged from preceding work at the ICI in Berlin, there is discussion of mediation, although in a religious spiritual sense, and I think that's also another sense which we have to bear in mind in all of this, right? The idea of the kind of mediator mediatrix kind of function in religious practice, and so we have work going back to for example, Christina Bowe and Dante's Hermeneutics of Salvation in 2007 has a chapter on language, mediation, and salvation. Although then clearly in that more theological mode. So I'd say I'm not, correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, please, anybody, but I don't think there was a particular locus classicus for us in terms of Dante studies, but more a coming together of various modes of approach in which we felt this kind of polyvalent notion of mediation. I think polyvalent is very much the thing. The fact that this has been a long-going multi-voice discussion, and one in which multiple voices and multiple modes have been kind of centered, is the importance of this for us. So it's a gathering of a decentralized notion rather than a one single strict codification of a term, and in that sense doesn't have a locus classicus because there are many loci. I think that would be my best attempt at a response to a fascinating question, and to be honest, a question which sounds like a study day in itself.
Certainly, if I can jump in, one thing that always was guiding us when we were putting the issue together and we were discussing what do we mean by mediation, and that's why the workshops and the study days and all of that were so productive, because we were really discussing. We were not just producing our own piece and bringing it together. It was really a mediation act in itself. So that was wonderful. The other thing is that I think I come to from a reception perspective, and I explore as well questions of influence and etc. And I think that reception as a concept in itself is too narrow. And I think in some ways it presupposes just a one act. What I mean is that is a one-way response to a text. So it's kind of a point of arrival, rather than, so we look, as a reception scholar, we look at the act of reception, we look at the final product, we see what has brought out of Dante, that act of reception. But with mediation, we really appreciate the whole process of going through Dante, of going and deploying different medias to go through Dante, as well as what Kat was saying was brilliant, and the way Dante himself and Helena as well is mediating something in its own textuality, being the Divine Comedy or the Vita Nuova or the Convivio. So I think is a more supple theoretical concept, is one that is not there has not been explored as much in Dante studies, but has been certainly used in art history, in arts and visual studies, for instance. And so we can definitely learn a lot from it and use it in its richness, in its interdisciplinary richness. And also one thing that is very interesting and Jenny brought out is the idea of good and bad mediators. Because when we come together, when we produce journal issues like those or books or chapters, we tend to create like a canon of good mediators. We never look at the bad ones. I've come like looking at Dante studies from a book historical perspective and looking at 19th century publishing on Dante, English, like Anglophone mainly. I've come across very poor forms of mediation from a historical perspective from the 19th century. But those two are moments in the history of reception that are fully deserving our attention, but we tend to like push aside because it does not produce the kind of like it does not stand at the same level of the object of reception in a way. But actually it would be very, very interesting to also develop this kind of strand of the discourse, like good and bad readers. What makes a good reader of Dante? How are we supposed to mediate Dante? As well as in our daily practice as teachers, as lecturers, as researchers. What are we doing correct, like wrong, and what are we doing like well, in a sense? So that those are my 2 cents. I hope I answered your question. Thank you very much.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Those are 2 good bookended responses that throw it out there. I imagined the intensity and the depth of the conversations at your various workshops and gatherings, which you've just alluded to. And so I'm happy for you that you got to have those. That's what gives this whole thing its richness, I'm sure. There's a guy in, I think he's in Liège. I can't remember where he is exactly. He's Italian, Stefano Lazarin, who's done 2 books, short, small books. One is called Dante Pop, and one is called Dante Trash. So he makes a kind of elaborate distinction between pop and trash that is based on Zizek and lots of cultural theory and various things. But he too has talked about, you know, good and bad. And he's not saying pop is good and trash is bad or anything quite like that, but there are people now who are starting to pay attention to non-canonical reappropriations. So, you know, there's another word that gets used sometimes. And so I'm intrigued that we as a group of people who are thinking about this mega text are now branching out in all these different directions. And so I thank you for your part of all that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do we have other questions, other comments, perhaps? Okay, I have a question which is partly, I'm asking it partly because of my own curiosity and also partly because of we are holding a series of usually talks or seminars at the center, which is entitled Dante Future. So I was wondering from your own mode of approach, where do you see your own research, your own way of seeing ways of mediating Dante going next? Federica suggested perhaps looking at Bad Mediators, but I wanted to hear from perhaps other speakers what they think about.
Kath, you want to tell us more about? Oh, Jenny. Sorry, I was gonna pick on Kath there for a second, but Jenny, Kath, I'm gonna pick on you next.
I was just gonna jump in, bearing in mind that I'm mainly drinking, not doing an academic event. No one else seems to be drinking very much, but I think that for me, the idea of looking at mediators is quite an important way to, which everyone in the project shares, you know, more or less, is the idea of bringing out new voices or different voices, and so it's one way to try to interrogate the canon or to broaden the canon or whatever we want to do with that. So I think that thinking about precisely that you don't have a direct encounter, and so where in being a bit, not, I mean, gratitude is sort of our concept, but being more grateful to those mediators that have brought you to that or that have influenced the way that you read it, which does mean, you know, in Bart's case, it means like also, I mean, bringing to the fore what Di was talking about as well with paratext, but the idea of being more grateful to footnotes, which maybe eventually means being great. Maybe it's a defense of an academic way of reading Dante, which is not necessarily where the future of Dante studies is going, if you think about Dante Pop or Dante Trash, both of which books I really enjoyed. But yeah, the next thing, if I want to be really personal on the future, I'm writing a chapter on Dante's Divine Comedy for the Oxford Handbook of Italian Literature, and I'm thinking about what aspects of these receptions and rewritings to include. And I'm also teaching Dante to first year comparative literature students, where it's about a module on canons and creativity, and I'm going to do a lecture on Dante and about canon formation. And I think that what's very interesting about Dante is that, you know, as everyone knows here, that he wants to be part of the canon, and yes, he became part of the canon, and that's great, but when he's writing an Inferno or something, it's like, I'm joining in with the classical poets and I'm part of the canon, but we forget how radical that is because it was so successful, you know. So there's sort of that aspect of it, but I'm wondering about which rewriting to look at, and it depends a lot on availability of translations and copyright and library copies, so it's a bit pragmatic, but that's what I'm doing next, I guess. But I don't know if people want to come in on that, but for me, I think that the idea of looking at mediators is extremely important for how we can stay within Dante studies but be a bit more open and a bit more welcoming to other voices and other perspectives.
Can I just jump in on that? Oh, sorry.
I'm happy to throw myself in there, actually, because I think that's really, if that's all right, Di, I don't want to.
Yeah.
You want to respond directly? Yeah, because I was going to say, I mean, I'm really interested in bias essentially at the moment, and I'm really interested in this whole issue as a means of sort of disrupting and defamiliarizing, and I think that's one of the sort of one of the very, very powerful ways of sort of rethinking scholarship in Dante, essentially. So that's partly why I'm so interested in video games. And I think what Jenny was just saying as well, sort of starting to push towards decolonizing potentially, I think. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, the sort of where I started essentially was from second generation cognitive science, which is all about bringing back together mind and body. So it's all sort of thinking about that, what I think of as a kind of Cartesian cul-de-sac in Dante scholarship in the last 400 years. And I think that's, you know, that sort of notion of actually how you can have, well, in second generation cognitive science, Gallese in particular, talking about simulation, talks about this notion of direct action understanding, which is why posture is so important in the Commedia, and, you know, sort of depictions in words of embodied action, essentially. So I think that, I mean, I'm not working on bias yet, apart from in my day job, but I just think that it's, you know, as a way of thinking through, you know, that 700-year intermission and sort of all the stuff that we bring to the poem that actually we need to try and fight our way past. I think that mediation is possibly quite a strong sort of model for thinking that through. I think we need, I certainly need a lot more sessions and some rosé, I think, to have that discussion, but I just lob it in anyway as a start point.
I'm waiting for you, Kath. I've got the bottle.
Could I hop in there, because I think both what Jenny and Kath have said also reflects, and reflecting back on this question of kind of good and bad mediators is precisely that one of the important things to recognize as we recognize mediation is to also recognize the bad mediation that exists in the history of Dantean canon formation, right? That the version of Dante, the dominant version of Dante, is in many ways probably the result of at least some bad mediation. You know, that when we talk about good and bad mediation, you know, we can talk about it in lots of ways. We can talk about it in terms of accuracy. We can talk about it in moral terms. We can talk about it in ethical and political terms. And you know, so there are various ways in which we can think about these notions of good and bad. And precisely, I think what's so great about having Martina's piece involved was thinking about fascist mediation, and also actually how readily Dante lends himself to a fascist mediation, and you know, thinking also about some recent work by and my brain has gone entirely blank, Dante Popolare.
Well, Christina Olsen wrote a wonderful piece.
Well, yeah, and there are other kind of mediations on
as well.
Lino, sorry, Lino Perti. Sorry, it's been a long Tuesday. Lino Perti, there's work on Dante Popolare and the ways in which there is bad mediation, and bad mediation has created the Dante we predominantly study or have been studying or have been teaching, and the ways in which we have to rethink often quite radically, I think, the kind of the Dante that we read, and that thinking actively about mediations to core, and thinking about mediation as a mode of engagement with Dante also allows us to read Dante better, because we're becoming more conscious, or because we're being cognizant of the limitations of an always mediated text. And in fact, the Commedia, in terms of Dante's texts, bar recent excitement about possible signatures, are always already mediated, because there is no the source does not exist for us in any meaningful way. So being aware of that and awareness of that can be very fruitful, and important, both in studies and in the classroom.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. I don't know if anybody else wants to say something, but since I see that some of you are already drinking, I suggest having a toast just to celebrate this great work and the publishing of this very, very important issue. So I don't have a glass now, but I suggest you, if you have one, feel free.
I'll raise the cup instead of the glass.
Yes.
Amazing.
Okay. So on behalf of everybody and on behalf of the center, I want to thank you again for coming this evening. And I think if you want to stay and chat more, we'll leave the meeting open. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very much again to everyone. And thank you, Silvia, as General Editors of Italian Studies. We are proud, and I hope you're proud of the issue that came out of this many months of work. So thanks again. And thanks again to Dai as well.
Thank you very much, Silvia.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for